Hello, ladies and gents. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Arib Malik. I'm currently a senior attending the American International School of Dhaka. And today, I stand before you to talk about one of the most global and one of the most pressing issues of our time, particularly in the financial industry, that I believe should be talked about more openly and with more rigor in our everyday discourse. So, as you can probably deduce from the big words behind me, my TED Talk today is about whether private equity will lead to the next 2008. For my financially savvy audiences out here, you might have already guessed what I'm going to be talking about. So bear with me, please. However, for the majority of you guys here, you might be wondering what those words behind me are even referring to. Private equity leading to the next 2008. Now, when I mentioned the year 2008, you guys might be wondering, well, it was a significant year. And yes, that is correct to a large extent. Politically speaking, 2008 was the year when President Barack Obama got elected, the first African American president in US history. Now that's a historical event to say the least. In terms of globalization, China hosted the Olympics for the first time, bringing together 3.5 billion people. This was unprecedented in the early 2000s, but thanks to the rise of the digital age and the internet, that was able to happen. Culturally speaking as well, our beloved Iron Man got premiered, and thanks to it, we saw the launch of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Although these assumptions are not wrong, the 2008 I'm referring to, unfortunately, ladies and gents, is unfortunately a much more scary, is unfortunately a much more gloomy, and is unfortunately a much more convoluted side of 2008. The not so good side about 2008, however, I do think it is important and paramount for us to address this side of the year as well, because I believe fundamentally that only through looking at our mistakes will we be able to ensure that it doesn't repeat in the future, and so that history doesn't repeat itself. So instead of beating around the bush, I'll just spill the tea. 2008 was the year of the US housing market crisis. The US housing market crisis eventually led to almost a fall in the US financial system. And this was unprecedented to a great extent. The fall of the US housing market eventually led to economies around the world almost collapsing in real time. From Timbuktu to Dhaka, we saw real GDP across developing nations as well as developed nations around the world faltering in real time. The fall of US dollar as well as the US dollar denominated assets meant that once these were thought to be a bastion of stability, these were thought to be a bastion of the American dream as well as free market capitalism, all of these elements were under attack. Now, you guys might be wondering, well, Arib, how did the housing market crisis lead to the financial crisis, and how did any of this happen in the first place? Firstly, to understand why the housing market crisis even happened in the first place, we need to understand about buying a house. To give you guys a lesson real quick, buying a house in developing nations like Bangladesh is vastly different to buying a house in, let's say, developed nations like the US. Buying a house in Bangladesh is relatively cheap. You guys might argue with me that Dhaka is a densely populated city. However, my counter-argument would be that land, labor, and capital, the three factors of production and economy in Bangladesh, is dirt cheap in international standards compared to other developed nations. For instance, a good house with like good amenities in a nice neighborhood like Gulshan will cost you north of $300,000. The same house in a same luxurious neighborhood with same amenities in expensive cities like NYC will cost you, and I can bet money on, north of $3 million. It's just more expensive in developed nations. As a result of which, people in developed nations utilize this concept of borrowing, or as the finance bros like to call it, leverage. Borrowing basically means, let's look at the house behind me. If I wanted to buy this nice house in the US, let's say it costs like $1 million. Obviously, I wouldn't have that much money in cash having around me unless I'm like involved in any other unethical profession. So let's say I have $300,000. And the rest $700,000, I simply go to a bank, I borrow the $700,000, and I pay the $700,000 monthly in installments with interest. So that's how banks make profit, with interest. However, the problem with 2008 was the fact that banks being banks, they wanted even more profit. So what did they do? They came up with an expansionary monetary policy, and at the time, the US government was also following an expansionary fiscal policy. So what does it mean? It means the government at the time of the US wanted the economy to grow. So just like our beloved Mr. Beast, the US government at the time was basically handing away free money at dirt cheap interest rates, so people would be able to buy and afford houses as well as increase their standard of living through this concept of borrowing. However, what happened was the fact that with borrowing there comes trust. However, trust broke in 2008, and with that also broke the US financial system. Basically, banks created this concept called mortgage-backed securities. This is a financial instrument, and I won't stand here and lie to you guys. It is a very multifaceted and complex issue. And truth be told, it's a TED Talk for another day. However, mortgage-backed securities, to put simply, is a financial instrument where banks pull together assets of different loans and sell it to investors. We have already established that in order to buy a house, you go to a bank, and then you later pay the money in interest. However, in 2008, what the banks did was that they basically grouped together some of these loans and sold it to investors. Now, you guys might be wondering, well, why would investors want to buy home loans in the first place? Well, connecting back to what I said earlier, banks make money through interest. So when banks sell some of these home loans together, the investors earn money through interest. However, the problem was that some of these home loans were genuinely good. People would be able to pay these loans back. However, truth be told, the rest were absolute garbage. People who simply did not have enough yearly income were taking on loans at unprecedented levels, and they simply could not afford to pay those loans back. As a result of which, people started defaulting on their loans. And with that, essentially came the crash. If I'm not mistaken, according to the housing price index, the points around the height of the housing market was around 180. After the crash, it became 130, if I'm not mistaken. So it clearly shows that when trust falls, so does the financial system. Now, you guys might be wondering, well, everything's cool about what I've said, and it's clearly interesting, but how does any of it connect to private equity? Bear with me for a few more moments, because in the subsequent slides, I promise you everything will make perfect sense together. Firstly, I do think it is important for us to understand what private equity is in the first place. Although it sounds fancy, the mechanism behind it is really simple. Private equity is basically when a private firm borrows money through a bank to buy private companies. And what do they do with these private companies? They invest in it, they make sure to increase the operational efficiency of these companies, and basically they sell it later for a profit. It's basically like flipping a house. You borrow a house for cheap, you renovate it, and then you sell it for a profit. Simple, right? And truth be told, private equity in and of itself is a beautiful concept. Let's look at some of the examples. Silver Lake is an infamous and world-known private equity. It bought Dell for, if I'm not mistaken, $24 billion. 5 years later, they sold it for $70 billion. That's almost a 5x return. Skype, another infamous company that was previously private equity. It was bought for around, I believe, $2 billion, and later on sold for almost $9 billion. That's, once again, almost a 5x times return, or a 500% return on investment. Private equity, when done correctly, leads to beautiful results and beautiful profit. However, with great risk comes great losses as well. Warren Buffett, our generation's best and almost the prolific investor from Nebraska, stated that when we take on leverage, it works, it does magnify your gain. However, when it doesn't work, it magnifies your losses. And the same goes with private equity. I've shown you guys good examples of profits. However, I would like to show you guys some of the prolific losses of private equity as well. Toys R Us is a company that was acquired by Silver Lake as well, if I'm not mistaken. And however, this time everything went absolutely wrong. Firstly, the debt ballooned to almost $8 billion. Instead of increasing the operational efficiency, the company rather was sinking in debt. 30,000 workers lost their jobs for an economy that is insane. And this really impacted the aggregate demand as well as the consumption of the US economy. Additionally, 5 months later, the company was declared bankrupt. So clearly, private equity, although it can magnify your gains, it can also magnify your losses. However, the question that did come to my mind was the fact that, was this an operational failure or was this simply financial engineering gone wrong? Well, I think the next slides will answer my question. Toys R Us are not just one example. Caesars Entertainment is another example. This company faced, I believe, $15 billion of loss. Next, we have Energy Future Holdings. This company faced $20 billion loss. And lastly, we have iHeartMedia. This company faced $25 billion loss. Private equity simply did not work. Although some of the private equity companies were borrowing money to improve the operational efficiency and later hoping to sell these companies for a profit, it simply did not work because sometimes it just happens. Companies in and of itself is a very difficult thing to run, and we shouldn't always expect for a profit. However, I do want to preface by saying that although private equity involves debt, debt in and of itself is not a bad thing. With debt, we are able to magnify our gains through private equity. With debt, we are able to improve our standard of living. However, it is important for us to understand that debt can also be bad. When private equity companies are not able to pay back their debt, economies suffer, people suffer, and as a result, our standard of living decreases. And this is very, very important for us to understand because private equity is a $20 trillion industry. This number should not be taken as a joke. If private equity, like 2008, falters, the economy around the world will face 10 times worse destruction. So, connecting back to today's theme, tomorrow together. In my opinion, today as I stand before you, tomorrow together isn't just about creating stable financial instruments or stable financial institutions, but also creating stable financial institutions that outlive us as well as is able to uplift undeserved communities. My TED Talk today, should be told, wasn't about whether private equity is the next 2008. It was answering the question whether we have learned enough from our past, from 2008, to prevent the next one. And if there's one thing I wish to leave you guys before I end my TED Talk for today, is that tomorrow together should be about accountability. It should be about transparency, and it should be about us taking the initiative to correct our mistakes from the past. Only then will we be able to succeed in our life as well as in the financial system. Thank you very much. This is Arib Malik, and I hope you were able to learn something from me today.